There is a version of the paranormal encounter that is, by some measure, more disturbing than the encounter itself. It is the version that does not end when the witness drives away. It is the version where the road between the encounter and the front door becomes the territory of something that has decided not to stay behind, where the witness arrives at the threshold of ordinary life and discovers that ordinary life no longer begins there. The 5 cases in this series share that particular quality. They are not cases of something seen at a distance in a field or sky and subsequently reported, logged, and filed. They are cases of something that came close, that tracked a car or a person on foot, that descended to the level of the road and blocked the way, that was still present somehow when the lights of home came into view. Each case generated a paper trail: the Project Blue Book report, the police dispatch log, the hospital admission records, the court filings, the congressional correspondence, the government documents eventually released through Freedom of Information Act requests or acknowledged in testimony. The witnesses did not simply describe what happened and fall silent. They filed reports. They sought medical attention. They contacted elected officials. And in every case, they paid a price for doing so that varied in severity but never dropped to zero. The following is the documented record of what they said happened to them on the way home. The light that followed them: White Mountains, New Hampshire, September 19 to 20, 1961. The drive from Montreal to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, was a journey Betty and Barney Hill had made before. It was 178 miles by the most direct route through the White Mountains, a road that could reasonably be expected to deliver them to their house at 3 Jefferson Place in Portsmouth by 2:00 inches the morning if they maintained a reasonable pace and stopped only briefly along the way. On the night of the 19th of September 1961, that journey took 7 hours longer than it should have. Betty Hill was a social worker employed by the New Hampshire Department of Health and Welfare. Barney Hill was a postal worker who also served as legal redress officer for the Portsmouth chapter of the NAACP and sat on a regional board of the United States Commission on Civil Rights. They were, by every available measure, serious and grounded people whose daily professional lives required them to assess situations accurately and report what they found without embellishment or evasion. When they arrived home near dawn on September 20 and could not account for the preceding 2 hours, neither of them immediately reached for the most dramatic available explanation. They noticed the time discrepancy. They noticed that something was wrong. They went to sleep. Barney was the first to observe the light, somewhere south of Lancaster, on U.S. Route 3, shortly after 10:30 inches the evening. Betty had also seen it, and she watched through binoculars while Barney drove, noting that it was bright and that it moved in ways that did not correspond to the behavior of any aircraft she could identify. What concerned them as they continued south through the mountain terrain was not so much what the light was as the fact that it appeared to be matching their movements, adjusting when they adjusted, visible through the trees when the road curved, reappearing on the open stretches. Barney had served in the United States Army during World War II. He had driven this road in daylight and knew the terrain. He pulled the car to the side of the highway more than once to watch the object through binoculars, and on at least one occasion he walked away from the car into a field to get a better view. What he saw through the binoculars on that last stop, he later described as the most frightening thing he had ever seen. He ran back to the car, told Betty they needed to leave, and accelerated south down Route 3. A series of beeping tones followed. The car vibrated, and both of them felt a drowsy detachment settle over them. The next beeping series they heard came from some point further along the highway. When they looked at the road signs, they were 35 miles from where they had been. The physical evidence waiting for them at home the next morning was not of the sort that could be attributed to ordinary fatigue or highway disorientation. Betty's dress, which she had been wearing on the drive, was torn at several points in a way she could not explain. The strap of the dress was pulled away from the zipper, and the hem bore a pink, powder-like substance that had not been there when she put it on. Barney's shoes had been scraped across the tops in a way he could not account for. Both of their wristwatches had stopped and never ran properly again. Perhaps most striking to the investigators who later examined it, the trunk of Betty's car bore a series of concentric circular marks, shiny and distinct against the paint, that had not been there the night before. When Betty moved a compass near the marks, the needle spun. When she moved it a few inches away, it steadied. She had no explanation for the marks. Neither did anyone else who examined them. Betty filed a report with Pease Air Force Base the day after the incident. Air Force investigators interviewed the Hills and submitted their account to Project Blue Book, the Air Force's ongoing UFO investigation program. The case was examined and not resolved. In October 1961, Boston astronomer Walter N. Webb, serving as a consultant for the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, spent 6 hours with the Hills, going over every detail of the encounter. Barney told Webb during that interview that he had developed what he could only describe as a mental block around portions of the event, that there were things he suspected had happened that he could not consciously access. The anxiety that both Hills carried in the months following the encounter manifested in physical symptoms: insomnia, ulcers, disturbing recurring dreams that Betty eventually wrote down across 5 consecutive nights because their detail and vividness were unlike anything she had previously experienced. In her written account of the dreams, she and Barney were taken aboard a craft, separated and examined. She woke every morning with the dreams intact and vivid. Barney refused to discuss them. In December 1963, more than 2 years after the encounter, the Hills went to the office of Dr. Benjamin Simon, a Boston psychiatrist and neurologist with a distinguished clinical reputation and specific expertise in hypnotherapy, which he had used extensively to treat combat trauma in World War II veterans. Simon's professional approach was rigorous. He hypnotized Betty and Barney separately, conducted their sessions on different days, and issued a post-hypnotic suggestion after each session that the subject would not consciously remember what had been discussed until Simon was ready for them to hear it. This procedure was designed specifically to prevent the cross-contamination of memory that critics of hypnotic retrieval had identified as the central methodological weakness of the technique. Under hypnosis, independently and without awareness of what the other had said, both Hills provided accounts of the missing time interval that were consistent in their central details. Simon, who was skeptical of UFO claims on professional principle and who never publicly endorsed the Hills' account as literally true, nonetheless stated clearly that the Hills were not fabricating, that something had happened to them that generated genuine psychological trauma, and that the consistency between their independent accounts was not something he could explain away. The story became public in October 1965, when reporter John H. Luttrell of the Boston Traveler published a 5-part account on the front page under the headline, "A UFO Chiller. Did They Seize the Couple?" The article had been based on a leaked account of the encounter rather than on the Hills' deliberate decision to go public, and it stripped away the careful detail and context that the Hills had preserved in their private documentation and in their sessions with Simon. The national press that picked up the story treated it primarily as a curiosity. Barney Hill, whose racial identity as a black man in interracial marriage in the early 1960s was already a source of social friction in predominantly white New Hampshire, found the public attention particularly destabilizing. He continued his civil rights work, continued his postal route, continued declining most interview requests. He died in February 1969 at age 46 of a cerebral hemorrhage. Betty Hill lived until 2004, spent the remainder of her life as a committed UFO researcher, and maintained until her death that what she and Barney had reported was accurate. The Betty and Barney Hill papers, including correspondence, personal journals, hypnosis tapes, and related documentation, are held in the Special Collections Archive of the Ezekiel W. Diamond Library at the University of New Hampshire. The journey from Montreal to Portsmouth on the 19th of September 1961 should have taken 4 hours. It took 7 more than that. Whatever the explanation, Betty and Barney Hill arrived home carrying evidence that had not been there when they left, with 2 hours they could not account for, and with a shared experience that would require 2 years of psychological distress and months of formal psychiatric treatment to partially surface. They had set out for home on a familiar road through familiar mountains. Something on that road had made the journey something other than familiar, and the marks it left on them and on their car and on their records did not resolve or disappear with the passage of time. Something on Route 150, Kensington, New Hampshire, September 3, 1965. Norman Muscarello was 18 years old in September 1965. A recent Exeter High School graduate, 3 weeks away from leaving for service in the United States Navy. He had been visiting his girlfriend in Amesbury, Massachusetts, and was hitchhiking home to Exeter on Route 150 inches, the early hours of September 3. Walking the sections where no ride materialized, moving through the low, rolling farmland of southern New Hampshire in the dark. Route 150 inches. Kensington is the kind of road that was designed primarily to connect farms to each other and to the larger highway system, rather than to carry traffic in the sense that urban planners mean the word. It runs through open fields and past tree lines, and between the occasional farmhouse, with its outbuildings and corral, and it is empty enough at 2 in the morning that a person walking it would have clear sight lines across the surrounding landscape in most directions. Muscarello had those sight lines when something appeared in the sky over the field to his right, and he saw it for long enough, and it came close enough, that he later described it in a signed statement at the Exeter police station as being as big as, or bigger than, a house. What Muscarello described arriving at the police station was a group of 5 bright lights, not arranged in a random pattern but moving together, appearing over a farmhouse approximately 100 feet from where he was standing, and then moving out over the adjacent field, dropping behind the tree line, reappearing, dipping and rising in a motion he described as similar to a leaf floating. The lights were bright enough to illuminate the area. They were silent. They came close enough to him at one point that he dove against a stone wall and flattened himself against it in fear. The behavior of the object was not consistent with anything in his experience of aircraft, weather phenomena, or ground lighting. He flagged down a motorist on the highway and got a ride to the Exeter police station, where he arrived, described by the officer on duty as white and shaking. Desk officer Reginald Toland took Muscarello's account, radioed Officer Eugene Bertrand, and asked him to accompany the young man back to the site. What Bertrand did not mention initially, because it had not yet connected in his mind to what Muscarello was describing, was that earlier that same night, around 12:30 inches the morning, he had stopped to check on a woman parked on Route 101 who told him she had been followed by a flying object with red lights for a significant distance before she pulled over. Officer Eugene Bertrand had 9 years of service in the United States Air Force before joining the Exeter Police Department. He was not a person inclined to accept unusual explanations for ordinary phenomena, and his Air Force background gave him a specific frame of reference for evaluating aircraft behavior that most civilians lacked. He drove Muscarello back to the Route 150 site at approximately 2:45 inches the morning. The two of them walked into the field behind the dining farmhouse toward the tree line. The animals in the nearby corral began to react before anything visually appeared. The horses kicked and whinnied, the farm dogs barked. Then the object rose slowly from behind 2 tall pine trees in the tree line, and Bertrand saw exactly what Muscarello had described. His formal statement, filed with the Exeter Police Department and subsequently forwarded to Project Blue Book, reads in part, "At one time, they came so close I fell to the ground and started to draw my gun." He described 5 bright red lights that flashed in sequence, that were extremely bright and made the entire field visible, that produced no sound, and that lit the nearby houses red as it passed over them. He dragged Muscarello back to the patrol car and radioed his dispatcher. Patrolman David Hunt arrived within minutes and also observed the lights as they moved away eastward toward the ocean. The Exeter Police Department contacted Pease Air Force Base immediately. Major David Griffin and Lieutenant Alan Brandt drove to Exeter, interviewed Muscarello and both officers, and attempted to dissuade the officers from speaking to the press. A Manchester Union Leader reporter had already reached Bertrand and Hunt before the Air Force arrived, and the story was already moving. Project Blue Book received the case file. In January 1966, Lieutenant Colonel John Spaulding, from the Office of the Secretary of the Air Force, responded in writing, "We have been unable to identify the object you observed on September 3, 1965. The Air Force subsequently proposed a series of alternative explanations, including a refueling operation called Operation Big Blast, involving KC-97 tanker aircraft from Pease." Bertrand and Hunt responded in writing directly to Project Blue Book, in a letter whose tone moves clearly from professional courtesy toward something closer to exasperation. Both Patrolman Hunt and myself saw this object at close range, checked it out with each other, confirmed and reconfirmed that it was not any type of conventional aircraft. It was absolutely silent, with no rush of air from jets or chopper blades whatsoever. And it did not have any wings or tail. It lit up the entire field, and 2 nearby houses turned completely red. Project Blue Book's final classification was unknown. Raymond Fowler, the New England regional investigator for the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, traveled to Exeter and filed a detailed independent report on the case. Journalist John G. Fuller spent weeks in the area interviewing Muscarello, Bertrand, Hunt, and the roughly 60 additional witnesses who filed reports in the weeks following the September 3 incident, and published his findings in 1966 under the title Incident at Exeter. The book reached the New York Times bestseller list. Fowler's report, Fuller's documentation, and the officer's own letters to Project Blue Book together constitute one of the more thoroughly cross-referenced records in American paranormal history. A convergence of independent testimony from a teenager, 2 police officers with military backgrounds, a handful of other motorists and residents, and the animals in the dining farmhouse corral. None of them agreed on what the object was. All of them agreed that something was there. Muscarello joined the Navy as scheduled 3 weeks after the encounter, served 3 tours in Vietnam, and came home a different person than the teenager who had walked Route 150 toward Exeter in the dark. He worked at the Alrose Shoe Company and lived quietly in Exeter for the rest of his life, rarely discussing what he had seen and never profiting from it in any form. His brother Thomas, speaking to a reporter in 2005, framed it simply, "Everybody made all this money, and he never made a penny." Muscarello gave exactly 1 formal public interview in the 15 years following the encounter, speaking to journalism students at Exeter High School in 1980. And his statement to them was the same statement he had been giving since 1965. He knew what he saw, and he wanted people to believe him. He died in April 2003 at age 55. Officer Bertrand died in 1998. Officer David Hunt died in 2011. The town of Exeter has held an annual UFO festival since 2010, organized by the Exeter Kiwanis Club, which raises money for children's charities. The festival takes place every September, on the anniversary of the night that something came out of the tree line over the dining farmhouse corral and showed Norman Muscarello how fast he could run. Howdy Stranger, Falkville, Alabama, October 17, 1973. Jeff Greenhaw was 26 years old and had been chief of police of Falkville, Alabama, for less than 2 years on the evening of the 17th of October, 1973. Falkville sat in Morgan County, about 60 miles north of Birmingham, a small agricultural community in a part of Alabama where farming and the railroad had defined daily life since the 19th century, and where the police department consisted essentially of the chief and whatever deputies and equipment the town council was prepared to fund. Greenhaw was off duty that evening, at home with his wife, when the call came in shortly after 10 o'clock from a woman who was nearly hysterical and whose name he never learned because she never gave it. She had seen a UFO land in a field on the outskirts of town, she said, on property belonging to a local farmer named Bobby Summerford. Greenhaw was the kind of officer who could not hear a call like that and stay home. He got up, put on his uniform, took his keys and his revolver and, as a secondary thought that would define what happened next, grabbed the Polaroid camera he normally carried for photographing crime scenes. He radioed the duty officer to say where he was going and drove out toward the Summerford property. He spent 15 to 20 minutes patrolling the field and found nothing. The field was empty. He concluded he had been the target of a prank, a not unreasonable conclusion in a small town in the middle of a national wave of UFO reports in October 1973, and turned his truck toward the exit track that led back to the main road. The track was narrow and gravel-surfaced, running between a fence line and a tree line, and his headlights reached maybe 100 yards ahead of him. At about that distance, in the middle of the track, was a figure. His initial assessment, driving toward it, was that it was Bobby Summerford coming out to see who had been driving around his property. That assessment lasted until his headlights hit the figure full on. He stopped the truck. He got out. He said later that he thought at that moment that the figure must be a person, that the explanation had to be ordinary, that a person in some kind of unusual outfit was the most he was prepared to accept. He walked toward the figure and addressed it. The exact words he used, according to the account he gave to the Associated Press and repeated in subsequent interviews consistently for decades, were, "Howdy, stranger." The figure did not respond. It did not move. It stood in the middle of the track and gave no indication that it heard him or registered his presence. What Greenhaw described seeing, and what appeared in the 3 Polaroid photographs he had the presence of mind to take before the figure began to move, was a humanoid entity, approximately 6 feet tall, and covered entirely in a seamless, wrinkled metallic material that reflected his headlights with an intensity he compared to polished mercury rubbed on nickel. He could not see a face. He could not see a seam where the head joined the neck, which suggested to him that the head and neck might be fused into a single, continuous structure. There was an antenna extending from the top of the head. The movement, when it began after he snapped the last photograph and turned on his patrol car's emergency lights, was not the movement of a human being. It did not walk. It moved in a series of spring-loaded propulsive steps that covered approximately 3 meters with each stride, an observation that became the most difficult element of the account to explain away, because Greenhaw was a reasonably athletic young man, and the figure simply ran away from him. He got back in his truck and chased it. He pushed his speed to approximately 35 miles per hour across rough terrain and could not close the gap. He eventually lost control of the truck on the uneven field, slid into a ditch, and watched the silver figure disappear into the darkness. By October 19, the photographs were moving through wire service channels and appearing on newspaper front pages across the country. Greenhaw had not sought the attention. He had filed his report through normal departmental channels and mentioned the photographs to colleagues in a routine way, and the story had reached the press through the ordinary mechanisms of a small-town paper covering an unusual local event. The response was not, for the most part, sympathetic. Some observers found the photographs convincing. More found them easy to dismiss as a tinfoil costume worn by a prankster, a hypothesis that gathered local adherents with notable speed. Within months, the Falkville Town Council fired Greenhaw from his position as police chief. His mobile home was destroyed in a fire on the 9th of November, 1973, barely 3 weeks after the encounter. No cause was ever conclusively established. The fire destroyed his copies of the original photographs, though negatives and prints had already been distributed widely enough to survive. Nearly 10 years later, in 1983, someone broke into his home and stole the 4 original Polaroid prints that had been locked in a safe, along with his service revolver and a shotgun. He filed a police report, and nothing was ever recovered. Greenhaw relocated after losing his job. He rebuilt a life elsewhere and raised a family, 3 of his 5 children adopted. In subsequent decades, he gave occasional interviews to researchers and local journalists, consistently and without variation, telling the same story he had told the Associated Press in October 1973, with the same specific details and the same measured tone. He never sought financial benefit from the account. He filed no book deal and gave no paid lecture circuit appearances. The Cullman Tribune, a regional newspaper that covered the aftermath of the encounter over many years, quoted him in a 2021 interview, making a statement that serves as a reasonably precise summary of what the encounter cost him. "I turned out to be a person I never dreamed I would be because of what happened. It made me hard, but it made me strong as well. I came close to losing my sanity, but my wife and God kept me from losing my sanity." He added that the encounter had permanently changed his understanding of whether other life existed in the universe, and that the change was not comfortable. A newspaper editor who covered the region from 1978 onward and later wrote about the case noted one element that she found telling in all her years of covering unusual stories. Greenhaw never monetarily benefited from the encounter, which is not the behavior pattern of a man who staged a hoax. The 1973 UFO wave that produced Greenhaw's encounter also produced 6 days earlier the Pascagoula, Mississippi case, in which 2 men named Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker reported being abducted from a riverbank by entities whose descriptions bore enough resemblance to Greenhaw's figure that researchers noted the connection at Espanseru the time and have continued noting it since. October 1973 generated more documented close encounter reports in the American South than any comparable period before or after it. Greenhaw's photographs, whatever they show, remain the only physical documentation from that wave taken by a credentialed law enforcement officer who was actively responding to a reported sighting when the encounter occurred. They are also almost certainly the most studied, disputed, and inconclusive set of Polaroid images in the history of American paranormal research. Something in the Road on FM 1485 Huffman, Texas, the 29th of December 1980. Betty Cash was 51 years old in December 1980 and ran a restaurant and a grocery store in Dayton, Texas. Her employee and friend Vicki Landrum was 57, a woman who carried a deep religious faith that would become central to how she processed what happened to her. Vicki's grandson, Colby, was 7, small enough that he could sit in the back of Betty's Oldsmobile Cutlass and be comfortable, old enough to be afraid of what he saw when his grandmother told him to look out the window. The 3 of them had been out for the evening on December 29, looking unsuccessfully for an open bingo game in the area east of Houston before settling for dinner at a roadside restaurant in New Caney. They left the restaurant sometime between 8:20 and 8:30 inches the evening and turned onto Farm to Market Road, 1485, a 2-lane country highway running through the pine woods north of Houston. A road used primarily by people who lived along it because it was isolated enough to offer no real advantage to anyone simply passing through. It was the kind of road you drove at night because it was the direct way home. Betty drove it because it was how she got home. The object appeared above the tree line ahead of them at approximately 9:00 inches the evening, and Betty slowed the car as it became clear that what she was approaching was not a fixed light, but something large and actively moving. The object descended to road level as they drew nearer, and at a certain point, Betty stopped the car because the object was directly over the road ahead and there was nowhere to go. What she, Vicki, and Colby described subsequently in interviews, formal statements to Air Force investigators, testimony in federal court proceedings, and repeated accounts given to civilian researchers over the following years, was consistent in its central details. A massive diamond-shaped object, roughly the size of a water tower, hovering above the road and intermittently shooting flames downward from its base. The flames appeared to function as some form of propulsion or pressure maintenance. When the fire stopped, the object descended slightly. When it blasted again, it rose. The heat radiating from it was enough to make the exterior of the car painful to touch. Betty got out of the car and stood outside it for several minutes, attempting to observe the object in detail. Vicki returned to the car to comfort Colby, who was terrified. Betty stood in the road and watched. What happened when the object finally cleared the road and began to ascend was almost immediately less interesting to the 3 witnesses than what they saw surrounding it as it moved away. They counted, as precisely as they could in the circumstances, approximately 23 helicopters. They were large, twin-rotor aircraft that Vicki and Betty both independently identified as military Chinooks, CH-47S. The tandem-rotor heavy-lift helicopters used by the United States Army. Betty specifically stated that at least some of the aircraft had U.S. Air Force markings. Both women were familiar with helicopters from years of living near facilities connected to the oil industry, which operated its own fleet of aircraft. Their identification was not casual. The helicopters surrounded the object in what appeared to be a tight formation as it ascended, and both the object and the helicopters receded together into the distance while Betty drove the now clear road toward home. Independent corroboration came from a Dayton police officer named Lamar Walker and his wife Marie, who told UFO investigators in 1982 that they had seen approximately 12 Chinook-type helicopters in the same area at the same time. Walker and his wife did not report seeing the object itself, but the helicopters they described were consistent in type and location with those Betty and Vicky had counted. The medical records from the weeks that followed constitute the most disturbing part of the documented record of what happened on FM 1485 that evening, and they are also the part of the record that is hardest to explain away. Within hours of arriving home, all three witnesses began experiencing symptoms that the physicians who subsequently examined them described as consistent with radiation exposure: nausea, vomiting, skin irritation, and eye inflammation. In the days that followed, their conditions worsened rather than improving as simple food poisoning or illness would have done. Betty Cash's symptoms were the most severe. She developed large blisters over her face, head, and neck. One blister covered her right eyelid and extended across her right temple. She lost more than half of the hair on her head. She was hospitalized 5 times in the year following the encounter, twice in intensive care. Her personal physician, Dr. Brian McClelland, told the Houston Post in 1991 that her condition was a textbook case of radiation poisoning, comparable in its profile to being 3 to 5 miles from the center of a nuclear detonation. Vicky Landrum developed breast cancer and suffered from chronic eye problems. Colby lost a small patch of hair and experienced continuing health issues. All three were examined by investigators from John Schuessler's team at the Mutual UFO Network, and their injuries were documented in medical detail. Betty Cash and Vicky Landrum wrote letters to their United States Senators, Lloyd Benson and John Tower. Their senators referred them to the Judge Advocate Claims Office at Bergstrom Air Force Base. In August 1981, all three witnesses were interviewed at length at Bergstrom by Air Force personnel, who told them at the conclusion of the interview that they should retain a lawyer and seek financial compensation for their injuries. Attorney Peter Gersten took their case on a pro bono basis. A $20 million civil lawsuit was filed against the United States government in 1982. The Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and NASA all denied having any aircraft in the area on the night of the 29th of December 1980. The case was dismissed in 1986 by a federal judge who ruled that since the government denied ownership of the object, there was no liable party to whom damages could be assigned. Betty Cash and Vicky Landrum had asked the government to tell them what had been on that road and what it had done to them. The government's response was that it had nothing to tell. Betty Cash died on the 29th of December, 1998, exactly 18 years to the day after the encounter on FM 1485. She had been hospitalized repeatedly in the intervening years and had attributed her deteriorating health consistently and specifically to what she experienced on the road that night. She never received compensation, acknowledgement, or explanation. Vicky Landrum survived her and continued to speak publicly about the case in the years that followed, maintaining the same account she had given since 1981 without material variation. Colby Landrum, the 7-year-old in the back seat, appeared on a UFO Hunters documentary in 2009 to discuss what he had witnessed as a child. The case generated a HBO documentary in 1985, an appearance on the television series Unsolved Mysteries in 1991, and extensive coverage in UFO research literature over the following decades. It also generated a question that no official body has ever answered. What were 23 military helicopters doing over an isolated Texas back road on a December night in 1980? And what were they surrounding? What came back with them, Skinwalker Ranch, Utah, and homes across the United States, 2008 to 2011? In September 2008, the Defense Intelligence Agency awarded a contract to Bigelow Aerospace, a Las Vegas aerospace company owned by entrepreneur Robert Bigelow, to operate a classified research program called the Advanced Aerospace Weapons System Applications Program, or AAWSAP. The program had been funded at $22 million through an appropriation secured by Nevada Senator Harry Reid with the support of Senators Daniel Inouye and Ted Stevens, and its stated mandate was to investigate unidentified aerial phenomena as a potential national security concern. The program was, by any reasonable measure, the largest formal investigation of UFO-related phenomena ever undertaken by the United States government that we know about, and it ran for approximately 27 months before it was formally closed. Among the conclusions that the program's investigators documented in the reports they produced during those 27 months was a phenomenon they called the hitchhiker effect, the repeated and documented tendency for anomalous phenomena to follow personnel who visited the program's primary field research site home with them, appearing in the residences of DIA analysts, security personnel, and senior officials who had made the trip to northeastern Utah and who had no prior history of such experiences and no obvious psychological predisposition toward them. The primary field site was a 512-acre property in Fas's discrediting Uintah County, Utah, southeast of the town of Ballard, known in the research literature and eventually in public as Skinwalker Ranch. The property had a documented history of unusual reports stretching back to at least the 1970s, and it had been purchased in 1996 by Bigelow's private research organization, the National Institute for Discovery Science, after a local family reported a sustained and increasingly severe series of encounters with anomalous phenomena that they could not explain or make stop. NIDS, under the leadership of biochemist Colm Kelleher, had investigated the ranch for years before AAWSAP was created, and Kelleher himself had noted the hitchhiker phenomenon during the NIDS era in an understated way. Investigators and their wives had reported seeing materializations of people walking through their homes in Las Vegas after extended deployments at the ranch, low-level manifestations that Kelleher described as innocuous but definitely present. What AAWSAP produced in terms of hitchhiker documentation was considerably less innocuous. The DIA, as one of its first actions under AAWSAP, deployed a team of 5 military intelligence personnel to Skinwalker Ranch to evaluate and corroborate the anomalous activity reports that the Bigelow organization had been generating. All 5 experienced significant anomalous events while on the property. All 5 returned to their home locations, carrying what investigators subsequently described as the hitchhiker effect. The most extensively documented case involved a naval intelligence officer who was given the pseudonym Jonathan Axelrod in the book Skinwalkers at the Pentagon, co-authored in 2021 by AAWSAP Program Director Dr. James Lakatsky, Colm Kelleher, and journalist George Knapp, which disclosed the program's activities and findings in specific detail. Axelrod was an accomplished engineer who would eventually be promoted to the rank of 2-star admiral within naval intelligence and who possessed top-secret compartmented information clearances at the time of his visit to the ranch. He was not, by background or training or professional history, a person given to misinterpreting ordinary phenomena as something extraordinary. What Axelrod reported after returning to his home in suburban Virginia was not immediately dramatic by the standards of the paranormal literature, but it was specific, documented, and escalating. Orbs of light began appearing in the house. Shadowy figures were seen moving through the rooms. His wife began experiencing the flare-up of existing medical conditions, specifically lupus and Raynaud's disease, at a rate and severity that her physicians found difficult to explain. Both of his teenage children developed intense flu-like symptoms at different times following anomalous activity in the house. What had been a normal middle-class home in Virginia became, in Lakatsky's documentation, something he described as an inferno of unexplained activity, and the family attributed it directly and specifically to Axelrod's visit to Skinwalker Ranch. Among the investigators who documented hitchhiker effects after visiting the ranch were Kelleher himself, physicist Dr. Eric Davis, DIA analyst Jay Stratton, and Robert Bigelow. Dr. Lakatsky told journalist George Knapp in a 2022 interview, "I mean, think of it. Did it get on a train or a plane to come to Washington? It left deep scratch marks on the tree it was resting against. There was physical evidence." He was describing an entity that one investigator had reported encountering outside his East Coast home after returning from Utah. The AAWSAP program, Lakatsky would note publicly after its findings were disclosed, determined that the hitchhiker effect was not confined to phenomena generated by Skinwalker Ranch itself. Their investigators found documented instances in which people who had experienced close-range UAP encounters in locations entirely unrelated to the ranch subsequently reported ongoing anomalous phenomena at their residences. The program's researchers examined a case from May 2005 which a biotechnologist named Ron Becker and his daughter were traveling outside Bend, Oregon, when 3 blue-colored objects flew from a nearby field toward their vehicle. The experiences that followed Becker and his daughter home from that encounter were documented in the AAWSAP research database. Lakatsky's position, stated in the book and in subsequent interviews, was that the hitchhiker effect represented one of the most significant findings of the entire program, precisely because it defied the framework through which most official investigations approached the phenomenon. If something could follow a government intelligence officer from a ranch in Utah to a house in Virginia, the question of what that something was had implications that went considerably beyond the UAP classification problem. AAWSAP was formally ended in late 2010. Its existence was not publicly acknowledged until investigative journalists reported on it in December 2017, and the detailed content of its findings was not publicly available until Lakatsky, Kelleher, and Knapp published their account 4 years after that. Dr. Travis Taylor, an astrophysicist who joined the current research team at Skinwalker Ranch under its new ownership, and who has spoken publicly about his own hitchhiker experiences, told a journalist, "We don't like to talk about the hitchhiker too much because everybody's afraid it's going to trigger it or something." Brandon Fugel, the property's current owner, confirmed to the same journalist that multiple members of his team and multiple visitors had reported anomalous phenomena following them home from the ranch, and that several military personnel had declined ever to return to the property as a result. The ranch is still operating as a research site, the phenomenon is still being documented, and the question that Lakatsky raised in his program's classified reports and later repeated publicly remains without a formal answer from any institution with the authority to provide one. What links the 5 cases in this series? From a mountain highway in New Hampshire in 1961 to a government intelligence program that ran out of a Las Vegas aerospace company from 2008 to 2011 is the particular structure of an experience that refuses to resolve at the moment when resolution should be simplest, the moment of going home. Betty and Barney Hill drove south through the White Mountains toward Portsmouth and arrived hours later than they should have, carrying evidence no one could explain. Norman Muscarello walked Route 150 toward Exeter, with something moving along with him that 2 police officers and approximately 60 subsequent witnesses also could not identify. Jeff Greenhaw drove back into Falkville with 4 photographs of something that cost him his job, his home, and his peace of mind. Betty Cash and Vicki Landrum pulled into their driveways in Dayton, carrying injuries that their doctors spent years documenting and could never fully explain. And the intelligence officers who flew back from Utah to their homes in Virginia and Nevada and elsewhere brought with them something that their families encountered in the hallways and the backyards and the bedrooms of houses that had previously been unremarkable. In each case, the road home turned out to be longer than the map indicated. In each case, something traveled it without being invited.